A former top U.S. military official says the threat of nuclear weapons actually being used is more probable these days due to the unpredictable nature of North Korea. And the former chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff admitted that he's scared to death of the possibility.
Former top U.S. military official has warned that North Korea may not stop at obtaining full nuclear capability, but go further and actually use it.
Which is, we live in a great time of uncertainty right now. And I think for those of us in the United States, we need our friends around the world to give us their perspective on what's going on here, on how nervous they are or how comfortable they are as they see us, because we're going through a great change. And there's great uncertainty here in our country as well as we try to sort that out. So I would ask our friends, particularly from Japan, but please constantly give us feedback on how things are going or what your questions are. And our friends from Korea as well, that's really important.
In an interview with ABC News on Sunday, Mike Mullen, former chairman of U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, said uncertainty has risen on the Korean Peninsula mainly because of the rhetoric that's been exchanged. He said North Korean leader Kim Jong-un is working hard to fully develop nuclear weapons and that he'll get there short of some form of deterrence. He added, though the Trump administration has strongly addressed this issue right from the day of President Trump's inauguration and has created options, it's still very difficult to know what's actually happening within the regime. Mullen said he's, quote, scared to death because if Kim sees using nuclear weapons as a way to solidify his future, then he could potentially use them.
Harry actually came to Japan last year and talked to us about what was going on. That was last July. Harry, a lot has changed since last July. And I hope you can give us some of your perspective with regard to that change. I'd be less than honest if I didn't tell you North Korea is top of mind everywhere I go. We talked about it today, but it is literally top of mind. So I hope you can give us some perspective there as well. And then lastly, before I ask Admiral Harris to come up, I'd also like to say thanks to my good friend General Riki, who's now, who again, we went through a lot together, he more than I, but will always be one of my heroes for his leadership in the middle of what was a much bigger disaster than any of us ever anticipated. And actually, I think it was his leadership that had a lot to do with finally being able to mitigate that disaster and get it under control. He didn't do that alone, but he was a much more courageous leader than a lot of people know. So it's great that we're back together again and that you're willing to co-chair this with me.
But North Korea watchers in South Korea believe it is highly unlikely that Kim will actually use nuclear weapons.
It's realistically not simple for North Korea to use its nuclear weapons for real. But I think it will be possible for the North to use its nuclear capability as a bargaining chip when discussing dialogue or sanctions with the international community.
North Korea has recently claimed that its nuclear development is aimed at achieving a balance of power with the U.S. The regime's official newspaper, Rodong-Sinmun, reported on Sunday that Pyongyang's nuclear weapons target no other country but the U.S. and that other countries do not need to fear them. Pyongyang stressed that its nuclear capability is what protects the Asia-Pacific region from U.S. ambitions to rule the region and that it brings peace and security.
As Secretary of State Tillerson rightly said after North Korea's ICBM launch, global action is required to stop a global threat. The alarming behavior exhibited by the Kim Jong-un regime is not just a threat to our friends in South Korea, it's a threat to Japan, it's a threat to China, it's a threat to Russia, it's a threat to U.S. allies in the Philippines, Australia, and Thailand, and it's a threat to the United States. It's a threat to the entire world because North Korea's missiles point in every direction. And it's the reason that we call for all nations to implement far stronger economic sanctions against Pyongyang. Kim Jong-un is on a quest for nuclear weapons on the one hand, and the means to deliver them intercontinentally on the other. Separate capabilities where he continues to make substantial progress. As the world saw on July 4th, North Korea now has an intercontinental ballistic missile capability. That means North Korean missiles have the range to reach North America and Hawaii. While I don't know if those missiles can actually hit what they're aimed at, but like horseshoes and hand grenades, getting close is all that's needed when you're dealing with nuclear weapons. Now I want you to stop for a minute and really think about this. Combining nuclear warheads with ballistic missile technology in the hands of Kim Jong-un is a recipe for disaster. And because he isn't afraid to fail in public, North Korean capability will continue to improve. So we must study and consider every possible step to increase the defense of our homelands with the best and most effective solutions possible.
The Japanese government has warned that another North Korean missile launch could be imminent. Quoting Japanese government officials, Kyodo News Agency says Pyongyang could launch another ballistic missile in a matter of days, adding that Tokyo continues to watch developments very closely. But it also added that military movements in the north could be part of the armed forces' winter training. Pundits have raised the possibility of a provocation following Washington's relisting of North Korea as a state sponsor of terrorism last week.
Speculation is rising about when the next provocation will come from North Korea. The Center for Strategic and International Studies predicts that there is a greater chance the regime do something involving a weapon of mass destruction within the next 2 to 4 week window. The think tank based in Washington says its big data analysis shows the likelihood of a provocation in the next 30 days on a rolling basis has been breaking records in the past couple of weeks. Just last Tuesday, it reached the highest level since the start of September. And the likelihood of a provocation in the next 14 days has also been climbing every day since November 15th. This means that a ballistic missile test could be expected on or around the 17th of December, the date of the previous leader Kim Jong-il's death. This prediction comes amid a rather quiet 2 months from the regime, despite new international sanctions and joint military drills between South Korea and the U.S. 2 factors could be behind this. The first are the technical limitations of tests in cold weather. According to analysis, the North has only conducted 3 tests in the last 2 months of the year in the 5 years Kim Jong-un has held power. In 2015, North Korea fired a submarine-launched ballistic missile once each in November and December, and in December 2012, it launched the Unha-3 ICBM. Another reason could be that the regime conducts annual military exercises in December, which take up all its time and resources. But historical trends aside, observers are watching the regime closely as the end of the year approaches to see whether its behavior is affected either way by Washington's pressure or the recent visit to Pyongyang by an envoy from China.
Additionally, Japan and South Korea and the United States are vigorously pursuing economic and diplomatic pressures aimed at persuading Pyongyang to give up its nuclear arms program. So at PACOM, we're doing our best to back up these preferred diplomatic options with credible combat power. That's why we deploy carrier strike groups with Aegis ships and the world's best submarines to Northeast Asia. That's why we maintain a formidable continuous bomber presence in the region. And that's why we continue our ironclad defense of Japan to include deploying our newest and best military platforms like the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, the P-8 Poseidon, and the MV-22 Osprey. And that's why I continue to emphasize multinational collaboration against a North Korean threat that endangers all of our nations. This includes increasing trilateral cooperation with the U.S., Japan, and South Korea, a partnership with a purpose if there ever was one. Our 3 countries share so much in common: democracy, free markets, a commitment to human rights, and we share common security threats. United, we're stronger, and I believe there is much that we can achieve with close cooperation. I also firmly believe that every nation who considers itself to be a responsible contributor to international security must work diplomatically and economically to bring Kim Jong-un to his senses and not to his knees. That said, my job as a military commander is to develop hard power options for the Secretary of Defense and our President. Many people have talked about military options being unimaginable regarding North Korea. Ladies and gentlemen, I must imagine the unimaginable so that we are always ready to fight tonight. I'll echo Chairman Dunford's recent comments in saying that what is unimaginable is North Korean nuclear-tipped missiles delivered in Denver or in Juneau or in Honolulu or in Seoul or in Tokyo. So I'll continue to provide military options to President Trump and Secretary Mattis while doing everything possible to emphasize our desire for peaceful denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. That includes calling on China to do more to exert its considerable economic influence to stop Pyongyang's unprecedented weapons testing. North Korea has only one ally, and that's China, and vice versa. That means Beijing has exponentially more influence on Pyongyang than anyone else, which makes China the key to a peaceful outcome on the Korean Peninsula. But, ladies and gentlemen, China is not the key for all outcomes. So we continue to find common ground with China about the North Korean threat, even as we criticize China's aggressive behavior elsewhere. For example, some in the press reported this week about an unsafe air intercept by Chinese fighter jets on a U.S. Navy aircraft operating in international airspace. Now, while it's always difficult to ascertain true intent of Chinese pilots, the vast majority of air and sea interactions between the People's Liberation Army and the United States continues to be safe and professional. I want to emphasize that. Most of our interactions with the Chinese military continue to be peaceful, safe, and professional. That's because both of our nations have worked hard to develop military cooperation consultations in an attempt to avoid miscalculations. That said, I remain very concerned about Beijing's increasingly assertive actions that run counter to the international rules-based order. Some might find it odd for me to advocate cooperation with China on the one hand while criticizing Beijing on the other. But as I like to say, great powers can walk and chew gum at the same time. By that, I think we can praise Chinese efforts for help on issues like counter-piracy, even as we rightly hold them accountable for not doing enough to influence their North Korean ally. I think we can and should do both. Accordingly, I'll remind you that the Chinese are building up combat power and positional advantage in an attempt to assert de facto sovereignty over disputed maritime features and spaces in the South China Sea, where they are fundamentally altering the physical and political landscape by creating and militarizing man-made bases and then using tone-deaf propaganda to justify these unprovoked aggressions as measures intended to rescue some wayward fishermen. As I've said before, fake islands should not be believed by real people. Then there's a Japan Defense Ministry report released last April that noted how Japan had to scramble aircraft more than 1,000 times in the East China Sea in the previous 12 months. 1,000 times, mostly because of Chinese incursions into areas rightfully administered by Japan.